Dr. Eric Helms has a PhD in strength and conditioning, is a pro-natural bodybuilder, and coach for Team 3DMJ. Expect to learn the latest muscle building science to make your workouts more effective. So Eric, if you were tasked with creating the least effective program and the worst possible lifestyle, how would you design this and what would it look like?
I would probably just walk into the room of most people living in westernized countries and be like, hey, tell me what you do, because most people are not getting a step count that is going to reduce all-cause mortality and provide a baseline level of cardiovascular health, as well as metabolic health. They're probably not resistance training. They're probably not eating enough fruits and vegetables. And there's probably the interaction between not being active enough and their energy intake, where hunger's dysregulated and they're eating far more than they need to. So I don't think we need to work that hard to construct the most suboptimal program in the world. I think that is kind of the Mount Olympus that we're all trying to climb as fitness professionals, is to see how do we shift over those societal level problems where the norm is actually people following something that is, at least in the modern world, something. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to be like the Luddite who's like, we need to go back to our ancestral routes. There's a ton of things that modern society are great at, like curative medicine. But I think on the preventative side, we've got a lot of issues that are a consequence of affordable, high palatable food availability and very non-walkable locations. And we don't need to walk even if we wanted to. Like, I can work from home. We figured a lot of things out during COVID, which is great. But it also means that I can sit literally in front of a screen working all day, not walking, not needing to exercise, get paid, provide for my family. But there's a lot of issues that are built into that. So it doesn't take someone who's an expert to figure out what we shouldn't be doing, because it's kind of the default, unfortunately.
Most of those things you listed there seem quite environmental. How can we go about shaping our personal environment to make it more conducive to tick those boxes?
That's a great question. That's a great observation as well. And the funny thing is I'm a physique sport competitor, coach, and physique sports scientist and strength sports scientist. So a lot of what works for that crowd, because they're very A-type driven personalities with specific goals, is to actively modify things and change things and rein in and tighten controls. So the willingness to modify their life despite their environment is there. However, I will say that one of the key things for an athlete like that to move into a more career-minded, long-term, sustainable, achieving their best peak in their sport, is to actually think more environmental, to make all of those things happen automatically and not need to think about it. The ingraining of habits and behavior change is the biggest challenge we have with the general population and just almost anybody with any goal. And the key friction point is that to make a behavior become a habit, you have to go through that tough phase where it is not a habit yet until it becomes developed. So the things you can do to reduce that friction are very important. So bodybuilders do that too. And the reason I bring this up is because once they shift their mindset away from, I want to do the hard things and let me watch another reel by Goggins, right? Just learn how to burn who's going to carry the ships and all this kind of masturbation of masochism, kind of hard work thing, which I get you, but we're bodybuilders. I get it. That's part of who we are, but maybe don't lean into the things you're already strong in. Identify your weaknesses, right? Because the way you get to elite level performance is not just busting through the wall. It's figuring out how you preserve as much energy as possible, pace yourself, and make the hard things feel easy so that you can do the elite level things when you need to for a long time. And I think there's a lesson there for the people in the day-to-day environment, that if you are white knuckling it, if you have to massively modify things and it doesn't feel sustainable, that might get you to a short-term goal, which you've probably done before. You've probably lost this weight once or twice. You've probably been on a healthy diet. You might have seen your cholesterol go down and then come back up. You might have been able to get off your meds, but now you're back on them. Unfortunately, that kind of revolving door is one that many general pop people walk through multiple times. So that'll get you there now, but it's not the thing that's going to keep you there. So environmental modifications are exactly what need to happen. So how do we do things like, all right, where do I have the opportunity to walk places? What types of fruits and vegetables do I like? What cooking skills am I missing? And how can I gamify these things, make them fun? Could me and my partner take a cooking class together and have that be something enjoyable? If there are things we want to work on our relationship, maybe we do that when we go on a daily walk to start the day, right? Um, Ultimately, I think attaching these behaviors to something else, just saying I'm going to walk every day, it's like, well, but why am I walking? Right? Well, for my health, it's difficult to maintain such a big picture perspective to modify short-term actions, right? You can't stay present with the fact that I might die when I'm 65, when you're 30, instead of I might die when I'm 75, but healthy and happy. That's not a constant motivating factor. However, if you can attach the behaviors that will get you there to things you're doing on a day-to-day basis and make them like connected together, this is something James Clear talks a lot about, like habit stacking. That makes these things possible. So, for example, I'm a researcher, online coach, and writer. One of the things that's very hard for me to do is keep a regular step count above like 4,000 to 5,000 a day, and I only get that on days I work out if I just leave my life default. I've also been married for 17 years now, which is pretty cool. And anyone who's been married that long will tell you that it's a relationship that you work on, you build together, you're a partner in life, and you decide we want to make sure that we're moving towards the same direction. And everybody changes a lot over 17 years. And if to make sure you're growing together, you got to check in and you have got to have conversations. So one of the things we decided we wanted to do was to have an opportunity to start our day together. So my wife and I, we go on a walk every morning and go to a cafe and have breakfast together. And the decision I make at the cafe is something that includes fruits and or vegetables and a lean meat and all the things that are sport supportive, but also health supportive as a bodybuilder. And it's also an opportunity to get in steps and for us to do that relationship checking. But I'm not holding present in my mind, this is going to get me to the 7,000 steps that plus exercise is going to reduce my all-cause mortality per this meta-analysis I read last year. I'm going, hey, this is a great opportunity to like catch up with my significant other. And I think that's just one example where there's a important meaning to it that is more immediate and maybe not immediate enough for most people. True, like obviously, like a lot of relationships fail, but for me, there's an immediate purpose, and I think of it, and that's what it means to me when I step out the door. And I think the more you can create things like that intentionally, the more those behaviors will stick. And then other things are just little tricks and tips, like out of sight, out of mind. Like you don't have to not buy the chocolate peanut butter that you like.
Ah, yes.
You don't have to not buy the cookies, but those should be in the back of the cupboard when you really want to be like, you know what, I want a treat, rather than easy to grab. And then the fruit bowl should be out there with fruit in it. Because then when the fruit starts to go bad, you see it, you smell it, it's right there. You want a snack. What are you going to, if you walk over and there's the opportunity to have a snack of a cookie or, an apple that you need to eat today, or it's going to be a little kind of weird and wrinkly, you're going to eat the cookie every time. So, but if that cookie is behind your cereal and some beans in the back of the cupboard that you have to walk over and open or go into the pantry, and the apple's right there, and you're catching it kind of early and noticing that hunger, you got a much better chance of actually choosing that apple. So a lot of things like that are really good to do to just kind of make your life a little bit easier. It's essentially about just shifting your whole philosophy from people who are in good shape and healthy, they white knuckle it and they do hard things in life, to how do I reduce the friction so that those things come easily?
I really enjoy that link between habit, environment, and meaning, because people that listen and consume fitness content at large know the major things they should be doing, but whether they're actually doing them is another story. How many people start off with New Year's resolutions as an example, good intentions, stick to it for a week or two, and then fall off? This piece of tying in a meaning to the activity that you're doing is an absolute game changer, because then when it feels hard to do, or you've got these other tasks that are taking your mind away from it, it can help you frame it in a way that is congruent with your values for why you want to do it specifically. That way you'll do the steps, you'll eat the food, you'll go to sleep earlier, you'll be consistent with your training, both from doing enough, but not too much as well, depending on your personality type.
Yeah, I totally agree. And when you look at some of the data, specifically on goal setting around the New Year's, and there is data on this, what type of goals are people more likely to maintain for longer? There's a couple things that shake out. One, people have some type of support structure around them, and they have some type of plan behind what those goals look like, and they have kind of like a check-in. So there's structure, there's scaffolding around those goals, so that when you are or that you aren't following those process goals, which is an important piece, there's something like an alarm that kind of goes off. You know it. Your friends who you check in with a weekly basis, your walking group, like, oh, Susie, you weren't there last week, whatever. But in addition, there's the framing, which comes to the meaning you're talking about of how do you view the goals. And sometimes the same goal can be framed in a facilitative or arguably debilitative way for what you're trying to achieve. So in exercise psychology parlance, there's what's called approach versus avoidance goals. And the idea of an approach goal is that it's telling you, you're saying what you want to do, and you're moving towards something, while an avoidance goal is trying to prevent or quit doing something that you're doing. And so, like I said, sometimes they can be the same thing. And it's also some of the self-talk that goes into it. So goals about trying to increase your health versus being less unhealthy may look the same, but when you can be about approaching something, instead of going, I want to be less sedentary, I want to be more active. It literally can be that simple. And then setting up structure around that can make a big difference. It's also linked to basically positive and negative, more facilitative versions of perfectionism in athletes. So there's what's called perfectionist striving and perfectionist concerns. So when you just look at the action that an athlete takes, it doesn't necessarily tell you about their mental state and likelihood of burnout. But if you understand their motivations for those actions, that does actually statistically predict the likelihood of burnout or overtraining. So for example, if an athlete has these kind of pursuit of excellence, drive to do everything perfectly, and they're very, very meticulous, that can result in high performance and not necessarily burnout if they're striving towards something, if it's the pursuit of excellence, if they have an approach goal, if they're working towards being the best version of themselves. However, if those same behaviors are stemming from a fear of not being good enough, or internal or external pressure from a coach or a team to not be shitty, basically, right? An avoidance goal. And if they're thinking, I don't want to let anybody down and all this stuff, it's all coming from a place of fear and avoidance. Those same behaviors are more likely to lead to burnout in that athlete versus the other. And the same thing is true of goal setting in the general population. So the meaning that is behind the behaviors really does matter. And then setting up support and check-ins and scaffolding, as I was saying, in a broader philosophical sense around the behaviors is also really critical. So yeah, just to support exactly what you were suggesting, I think the data does show that.
Given that we can get to the same destination with an approach versus avoidance goal, why is it human nature to have a propensity to the negative as a means of fueling us towards our goals?
Well, sometimes negatives can be the trigger to awareness, right? You look up one day and you're like, oh God, who is that looking at me in the mirror, right? Or my 4-year-old ran across the street and I chased after him and grabbed him because I didn't want to get hit by a car, and I was out of breath. Like, what has happened to me? Who am I? I think there are these moments where we have a incongruence between who we want to be, who we think we are, who we might have perceived ourselves as being, and then who we realize we are, or the deficits we have now. So we never want to discount the fact that sometimes these are our biological drive. If I was to put my evolutionary biologist hat on, which I'm absolutely not one, but I'm happy to make some general statements and not get too much expert creep.
Disclaimer thrown in. Let's go.
100%. Yeah, I'm a physique sports scientist, so take all my evolutionary biology suppositions with
bit of bro science, all right, every now and then, Eric. Don't worry.
Absolutely, big grains of salt here. But if you do look at some behavioral psychology, you will see that if you are given like 10 positive compliments and one negative, uh, you know, critique or insult, there's going to be a disproportionate weighting, and they might feel the same. Like it takes far more positives for most people to have the same impact as one really harsh negative, and that's probably related to the risk associated with them in our more baseline environment. Like, oh, good things, sweet. That might help the tribe. That might help me. Okay, got some food. Great. Oh, tiger, I'm dead forever. Like, so I need to identify those things and respond to them. And I am here today as someone who's got the genes that got passed on because I overweight the negative. Really useful for tigers, probably not too useful for like the modern built environment, right? So I think that is part and parcel of who we are. That's not going to be going away anytime soon, unfortunately. But so you can leverage that. If that spurs you to action, if that gets your adrenaline going, if that is a rude wake up call, if that triggers the action, great. But what is the action then? And then the action should be something that is what we talked about. All right, I'm going to create some approach goals. I'm going to contact some friends. I'm going to, change my environment. I'm going to do things that are striving to be stepping into who I want to be and who I identify as, and creating this new lifestyle, rather than really dwelling on that negative experience and going, oh, I don't want to be a fat slob anymore. Or, oh, geez, I don't want to be unhealthy. Or like, I hate who I am. Like that type of fuel typically has a cost. And it doesn't seem, based on the data, to lead to where you want to go long term. And the more you can also set up, going back to what does that action lead to, process goals is very important. There's also behavioral psychology research on whether you're focusing on the outcome or the process. And there's a cool study by Fishbach and Choi that came out, I want to say in the 70s, and I might be slightly misremembering it, but I think it's titled, could be the 90s. I think it's the 90s, and it's titled When Focusing on the Goal Undermines Goal Pursuit, or something very similar to that. And they took these various different activities from, I think, yoga to folding origami to walking on a treadmill or running on a treadmill, which is the one I'll focus on, to maybe even like brushing your teeth. And they found the same thing held true. So the treadmill experiment, what they did was they had people in two different groups who were either focused on the process and the experience and the things they liked about running on the treadmill, or the reason they're running on the treadmill, what they're trying to accomplish. I want to be in better shape. I want to lose weight. I want to increase my energy expenditure, whatever, performance or health or body composition related goal, the outcome. And then they had them predict how long they thought they would run on the treadmill. And then they gave them the opportunity just to run on the treadmill for as long as they wanted. And they looked at which group ran longer, and then how did their expectation of how long they'd run on the treadmill match the outcome. And two really important things happened. The process-oriented group that was focusing on what they liked about running on the treadmill ran for a longer period of time than the group that was focused on the outcome of why they were running on the treadmill. More so, the group that was focusing on the process over exceeded their expectations. They thought, I'm going to run for 15 minutes. They ran for 20. And the exact opposite happened in the group that was focused on the goal. I'm going to run 15 minutes. They ran for 10. Those aren't the exact numbers. But the point is that they set themselves up for success and even over success, or underperformance or failure, because they were so focused on, I want to be leaner by running on the treadmill. Well, that's not going to happen today, and, trying to climb Everest in one workout is going to be disheartening. And like, why am I still running? Right. But if you're going, man, I like the way my body's moving. I like the feeling of exerting myself. I'm doing something productive right now. If anything, that's going to make you want to run even longer. And that's exactly what we saw. So I think it's really important to have the right mindset around these things, or you can kind of be off on the wrong foot from the start. And one of the things that we as trainers often focus on is not the mindset, because we like to train. Like, when someone's like, Eric, you're so disciplined, I'm like, it's kind of like saying, hey, this you 13-year-old, you're doing great for playing video games. Like, I like this shit. Of course I'm going to keep doing it. So I think we don't think about what are the mental gymnastics, hoops, and reframing and mindset that our clients or the people we communicate with, if we're a content creator, might need to be successful with this, because we've already done those things and they're kind of built in for us. So we're more focused on what optimizes it, what makes it better. What is the, like, if I had better information, I would do something different, and so would you. That's the missing assumption. They actually have an overabundance of information. That's the kind of the social media environment, which can sometimes be paralyzing. But really, what they need is to figure out, how do I get myself to a place where I have a set of behaviors, activities, and a mindset that makes this happen. And then at that point, when I've got that, once I'm bought into the cult that you and I are a part of, okay, then how do I make it better? Like, then I can start biohacking. But all the biohacking stuff is a huge waste of breath and air, and it's only targeting, it's preaching to the converted in many cases, unfortunately.
It's fascinating how powerful the mind is and how there's that disconnect between what we do and what we should be focused on more often, the whole process versus goal situation. And anyone that's done any self-work, reflection, understands that the process is everything. The goal, when you do achieve it, is short-lived, etc. But our conversation between each other is never in that vein. It's not so sexy to say to someone, yeah, man, I'm really proud. I'm enjoying the process thoroughly. I'm going X days a week, etc. People want to know, what's your PRs? How heavy are you lifting? How lean you are, etc. And speaking from a values perspective tied into the process is a way we should be shifting the communication to have a more healthy, sustainable approach, in my opinion.
Absolutely. And that comes to athletes too, who are wholly consumed and focused on the outcome. But when you focus wholly on the outcome, you're actually doing something that's like the cardinal psychological sin that no athlete ever wants to do, is you're giving up power, right? So when you're saying that I only care about winning, you're essentially opening yourself up to the possibility of someone who is just straight up better than you right now taking the power away from you. And this is even more apparent when you get into the sports I deal with, like bodybuilding and powerlifting, right? There's no defense, right? Like, you can't go up and kick somebody in the shin while they're doing a sumo deadlift. I mean, you can, and maybe that's a good strategy. I haven't seen anything in the rule books against it. But ultimately, you show up as strong as you are, you put together the biggest 3 lift total you can, and you let the chips fall. And if you had a prep that went fantastically, each one of your lifts went up by 15 kilos, and you crushed it on the platform, you went 9 for 9 and hit a PR on all 3 lifts, the evaluation of that, the objective evaluation, what you need as an athlete to do your analysis of what went right, what went better, what do I work on, should be informed by that. But if some other person came in and just is stronger than you, and that changes your evaluation, now you're giving up power, right? You're also letting them dictate your happiness and your satisfaction. Now, I'm not saying you have no emphasis or placement on the competition outcomes, because why would you compete at all? But you need to be able to go, right, that prep was fantastic. I did really well. That person's stronger than me. Okay, what can I do in the future if I want to be competitive with them? And you might go, well, I'm just going to need more time. Or maybe I just have to accept that they're better than me, but I'll keep improving. I might catch them on an off day. I don't know how long they're going to be in the sport. Maybe they're going to plateau. Maybe they're going to slow down. I'm still in a peak. Like, you don't know. But you can really only modify the things that you have agency over. And even more so in bodybuilding, it's a subjective sport. You don't get to control who shows up and how the judges see it. And it's the self-comforting thing to go, oh, it was politics. Oh, that was the judging, and you immediately will feel better about a loss, right? I placed 3rd, but you know what? The guy who won, I'm pretty sure that was his buddy on the judging panel. So now it's like, I actually won, is what you're telling yourself. I don't have to face, the things about my prep that didn't go well or whatever, whether you cognitively realize you're doing that or not, but you're self-soothing because you put a lot of work in, right? You feel like you trained and you deserve a certain placing. But unfortunately, the sport doesn't care about what you deserve, right? So you have to be able to be objective. And this is where now you shift back to like the Goggins mindset or the Jocko Willink, like extreme ownership. And you go, oh, maybe there's something there. Like, let me see what I can learn from this loss instead of self-soothing, where you feel like you're taking some power. You're like, oh, no. I didn't lose. I won. But what you're actually doing is saying, I can't change. I can't learn from this experience. And I'm closing off doors and opportunities for self-improvement moving forward, because I have been unwilling to look at this outside of my own emotional response and soothing that. So that's, it's a parallel thing to our conversation, but there are links between both. And I think it's just really important because people don't really realize when they're doing that and that that's actually what they're doing. They think, oh, I'm a competitor. I'm motivating myself. I'm focused on the prize. Winning is the goal. But actually what you're doing is you're giving up power. You're now allowing external factors that are outside of your control to dictate your actions more than the factors that are within your control. And that's not a helpful thing. And as a coach, it's my job to really help someone realize when they're doing that. Like, think about what you're doing. What decision would we have made if this has happened in a vacuum? Okay. Now you're deciding that this was a bad prep when things went really well. So we're going to change things, is that the right call right now? So I think that's reflection and awareness are by far the biggest things in anyone's corner, and a lot more than the nuts and bolts.
Can you talk me through this idea of optimal workouts? This topic, in a similar light as we just discussed, is subject to change because your circumstances change. So can you elaborate on why the optimal workout or optimal anything might be something that's not even possible?
Yeah, it's an ephemeral thing. Like, it probably is possible, but even if you did it, you wouldn't know, right? So optimal, what does the word mean? It means the best possible, right? It is on a scale of, as we're getting closer and closer to the perfect workout, which needs to be taken into consideration with your environment and all that other stuff. First off, most people just don't even apply the term. If we assume it is possible to reach it and knowable in the right context, they're leaving out what we would generally call is the biopsychosocial model, right? The idea that every single day and every single minute, you're in a different environment, you're in a different mindset. And if you were to go to the gym, even if you wrote out the quote unquote, what should be optimal program and your nutrition stayed the same, but if you watched a video that was depressive versus a video that was motivational, your performance and therefore your adaptations would be different. And we have data to support that, right? So first you have to just acknowledge that. You can set the same, you can hold certain variables constant and you can change other ones that aren't necessarily in your control, and something gets de-optimized or enhanced, right? So the first step is to go, all right, optimal needs to operate within a set of constraints, and these constraints are moving targets, okay? So we're optimizing within the constraints of whatever, and that's often self-selected. So for example, I'm competing in bodybuilding, but I'm not going to sacrifice my performance as a husband, coach, mentor, researcher, etc. I'm not going to cross certain lines in my life. Like I'm going to compete in drug-free bodybuilding because I don't want to get on the enhanced train and find that at a certain point I just have to up the dose. That's not a health concession or a psychological concession I want to make. So that calculus are self-defined, the constraints you want, to the degree you can. But there's also a lot of other constraints you can't predict. Get hit by a car, shit happens, right? Or you just don't sleep well. Like you didn't get to have full agency over that. So first step is optimal within a given set of constraints, and those constraints are constantly changing. And what your constraints are not the same for someone else, so you really can't actually judge outside of yourself. The second thing to consider is, okay, so now you're trying to get to perfect within these constraints. What informs that decision? How do you determine what's optimal? And where most people start in this industry is, well, I'm going to find a champion. I'm going to find who the best is, who I perceive to be the best coach, the most intelligent guru, or sometimes people, I made a Threads post about this today, sometimes people get off that bandwagon because they realize it's mostly just the cult of personalities and sales tactics and BS. Not that we shouldn't learn from the anecdotal experiences of people, but generally what one person does probably won't be the one size fits all for everyone. Who knew? So you go, okay, I don't want that. And then they replace the guru with a new guru and they call it science, which of course is not a guru, because science, the basic philosophy underpinning it is that it is open to inquiry, constantly updates itself, changes, and it speaks in probabilities rather than absolute terms, and that we're always getting closer to, but never actually achieving something near truth, right? So you can't call science a guru because it doesn't give you that. But people want, they go, okay, if the 10 commandments of insert fitness influencer were not right, and that's just their take, and maybe it's worked quite well for them, but I can't know if a alternate reality version of their twin would have done better or worse with a different setup. Can't know. All right, I want something more objective. Let me go to PubMed. And then you start to, and then you go, okay, well, whatever PubMed says, I'm going to take the latest meta-analyses, I'm just going to do that. And you start to realize the reality of science, what I just stated, and also that it's talking about population norms and all this stuff. Then you go, crap. And you have to accept we can't know what optimal is. And that all we have are these tools available to us to make better observations, which includes both the anecdotal experiences of everyone who's been in the game and is doing their thing in fitness, because that observations are observations, whether they happen in a lab or not. They're a little more controlled. We might be able to use statistics to extrapolate the big picture pieces to everybody else. But now these things go hand in hand. Now we go, okay, so I can use science to get a ballpark of where to start. So I know that for most people, when they're doing a training program that lasts 2 to 4 days, per week, over 8 to 12 week periods, when they're training to their perceived failure, I should probably be doing, if I want optimal results, not necessarily a good return on investment on my time, but optimal results, meaning slightly better for a lot more work, I should probably be doing 10 to 20 sets per muscle group, right? Okay. And then you also know, and there's probably a 20, 30% chance that I fall on either side of that distribution, that I am actually someone who would respond better to 6 to 8 or 20 to 25 sets. That's possible. But if I'm playing the odds here, where I start, it's probably somewhere in the middle. And then all of a sudden you shift towards, okay, I want to be a really good anecdotal observer of my own experience. And how is that going? Is it working well? Am I seeing progress? And then I adjust from there over time, which is what a good coach does, right? It just facilitates that process and helps you be more objective. So you're never at optimal, even if you're following exactly what the research says, because you are not a population average. You're not the 95% confidence interval. You're an individual data point. So you have to figure out where to go. So you use the broad brushstrokes with the scientific principles that are pretty well established, with multiple studies behind them. And then you almost completely shift over to, all right, starting from there, I think there's a high probability that I'm closer to what's best for me. And then I course correct for the next decades. And then occasionally when new research comes out, I go, oh, maybe the starting point was a little different. Or now I have another tool to observe. So whether you're following a guru or whether you're making science your guru, it's not the right way to go, because they're starting with a false premise that there is such a thing as optimal. You can find that out right now, and you just need to, put your faith in me. I will be your personal Jesus, either PubMed or, random jack guy or gal on Instagram.
If there was an idea as optimal being true for everyone, we'd all be doing the same thing, right? So this idea of science as a guideline helps to shape our decision-making is absolutely fantastic. But there's almost this naivety that comes from subscribing to something that is optimal, this full confidence, and you're almost placeboing yourself into it's going to be the best thing ever. So sometimes I find that the people that don't know as much, or they just laser in on this approach is going to be the best and they believe it with their whole heart, they put their full faith into it, can achieve better results. So that just adds another spanner in the works for this optimal discussion.
Yeah, and I think those people also get really great results from supplements that do nothing. Like if they believe, then the marketing will be enough. And I think you can still have that. You just have to basically reframe your perspective on reality to what's the most I can know. And that's an uncomfortable thing. So if the most you can know is that I have a higher probability of being right with this program, that can become the placebo. You know what? It's not exciting. It's harder to sell. But if it goes from, I don't know, frickin' insert the name of your favorite influencer who convinces you with their personality, this is the best program. You're going to make gains like never before. And you're like, hook, line, and sinker, I'm in, baby. And then you get 20% better gains because of that expectancy effect and that driving you to work hard. If you can shift from going, all right, well, they don't know what's better for me any better than anybody else, and probably worse than what I know if I just looked at my own training history. However, I know that the chances are I'm probably not 5 standard deviations from the mean. I might be 3, 99, 95% chance, but most likely I'm 2 standard deviations from the mean. So let me start somewhere in there and then, use my priors, as we say in Bayesian analysis. Like, what do I know about myself and what didn't work previously? And now I think I've got the highest probability of doing something that's as close to optimal as I can know. Let's go. Like that can be the closest thing you can get. And I think a lot of us nerds in the evidence-based crowd, that's where we're at. It is like you described it. Essentially, you're Banky. It's a safety blanket. Like I know what I'm doing. It's backed by 3 meta-analyses and my best understanding of human physiology and principles and, 5 years of experience. Let's go. I'm ready to rock. I'm going to crush it this offseason. That's not that different to going, listen, this guy won 6 Mr. Olympias, and I bought his ebook and I spent the money. I'm ready to buy in. It is just perhaps a few more levels of mind-blowing realizations about what we can and can't know about the world.
Once you understand that the idea of optimal doesn't actually exist, it's very freeing in a sense, because if you believe that you have to do all these things within a certain set of parameters, you got to do exercise like this, you got to use this rep range, you have to use this training split, that works fine if you're able to do it. But what happens if you get an injury, certain things happen in your life where you have to deviate from the optimal? You will experience more of an adverse response to that than the person that's just training and thinking, what I'm doing suits the guidelines, it's good enough. It may not be the best in this particular time, but I'll still make progress. Might be a bit slower, but I feel that awareness of not overly stressing if you're not around that optimal or guideline situation for your training can help you do less harm to yourself.
I totally agree. And not to shamelessly self-plug, but that reality of people who had basically just an on or off black and white perspective of, I've lined up all the things that I know are hashtag evidence-based or hashtag optimal, and that's the only way I can feel comfortable training or know that I'm getting optimal results, or I'm afraid, or I feel like I'm, being unfair to myself, not reaching my full potential. I'm selling myself short, kind of thing. The only way I was able to get around that, and part of the principal problem there, and how people get into that spot, is because they don't have any weighting system or hierarchy or priority understanding of how those things impact things. Like, yes, they may have an impact. Like, we may be able to have a study where we go A is better than B, but what does that really mean for you in the context of everything else you're doing? What does protein timing really mean in the context of you training over 10 years with a great program, consuming a sufficient amount of protein, already eating 3 meals per day, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So when I created the muscle and strength pyramid, which is, it's books now, and it used to be videos, and there are individual guidelines. You could be like, oh, what's Eric's guideline for protein? That's not novel. That's just me collating information. I'm just basically a museum curator. What was novel and really seemed to sit well with people and impact with them was the pyramidal structure itself, which was a hierarchy where I sat down and I thought about, all right, what are our big rocks? What are our pebbles? And what is our sand? Which things are interdependent? Which things are redundant when you've taken care of something else? And which things can have an impact, but it's so small that you won't be able to actually tell the difference. Like, for example, if we assume citrulline malate does have a 0.18, standardized effect on enhancing your volume performance, and then if that volume performance does lead to additional hypertrophy, will you ever know? The answer is no. But the answer is there's actually a real effect at the population level based upon the most recent meta-analysis. But that may change. It's only one meta-analysis, and with that small of an effect size, 3 more studies, it could tip it the other way. So we don't know. But the point is, there are some things that we have a really a good understanding of its effect, but it is less than a single human would ever be able to test or notice or identify the pattern or see the benefit over a long period of time. So that means the amount of time and effort that you should invest in that should be considered compared to something like not being in a calorie deficit when you're trying to gain weight, right? So the pyramid starts on both the training and the nutrition side with the biggest rocks at the base, the foundation, thinking like an architect, right? So we have energy balance and macronutrients kind of making up the biggest pieces of the nutrition pyramid. Not that you necessarily need to do if it's your macros or track or anything, but the behaviors or whatever process you choose to get those things in order is going to have the lion's share of the impact before we start talking about micronutrient stuff, before we start talking about nutrient timing, before we absolutely start talking about supplements. And on the training side, same thing. We've got this base of adherence. You trying to fit a 4-day schedule into your 2-day per week, lifestyle of best case scenario, how much you can train, setting up for failure. Okay, but once that's taken care of, then we can think about volume, intensity, and frequency. And then we can think about exercise selection. And then we can think about stuff like rest periods and tempo and quote unquote advanced techniques. But the way that information is typically shared and promoted, we know even in finally, the evidence-based community's caught up and they realize the power of marketing. It wasn't just like if you went back 15 years, proto-social media, the way the evidence-based community got its foot in the door of the well-established, fitness and industrial complex that has been built on marketing since literally the late 1800s. We're talking Eugen Sandow's Coco that he sold as a muscle builder, right? And him saying, hey, it's these little tiny 5-pound dumbbells that got me this physique. Definitely not the over 200-pound overhead presses that I do almost every weekend. That marketing has been there literally for centuries, right? Or more than a century. So how do we get around that as evidence-based professionals? Well, 15 years ago, it was just, I've got a great personality and I'm smart and I'm selling you science. So basically, I'm the anti-guru guru. But finally, which I don't think is a great model, right? And it also lends itself towards a bunch of assholes leading the charge, which, people just don't want to listen to you. And that's starting to fade away. But now we have people like your Jeremy Etier, we have your Jeff Nippards, we have Greg Nuckols with showing that blogs are still viable. I'd like to think I'm doing all right, and there's a bunch of other people who understand that marketing is important and that you have to get people's attention. The consequence and the tightrope that you walk is that the clickbait title that goes the one thing you're missing, and then you talk about energy balance, people believe it. Like they go, this is the one thing I'm missing. This is really important. And if you use that to talk about something like nutrient timing, you may give factually correct information in your video or your post or your reel, but everything is being told to the person that all of it's the most important thing in the world. So the reason why I created this hierarchy, this prioritization system, was because people knew everything. Like it wasn't a lack of information. None of my guidelines surprised them. Like, oh, what? I should have a higher protein diet? That wasn't the thing. It was that they didn't know how to value and weight having protein post-workout versus having sufficient protein in the day versus having sufficient calories on the nutrient timing side or creatine. They're all the most important thing. I have to tick all those boxes. That's what led to that, or at least part of that black and white thinking that I alluded to, is I feel like I've let myself down or I'm leaving something on the table. I have this fear of missing out on gains. I got the FOMOG because I haven't ticked every single box because all of them are 10 out of 10 importance because that's the way we've learned and been taught to market by the algorithms and social media. So just simply coming in and saying, guess what? All of these things are true that you know. That's not important, that's not important, that's not important, relative to these things that are important. And now you've got a finite amount of energy, time, effort, and you're at wherever you're at in your career with this changing your environment and making decisions and how much white knuckling versus making it easy by changing just what you do on a day-to-day basis without thinking about it that we already talked about. Where's our entry point and what do we focus on? And maybe for you, it is just the first 2 levels of the pyramid. And once we nail that, we can start moving up. Because right now, you're trying to do all 5 levels and everything that's in my book simultaneously, and you're failing at all of it. So that is a really important concept. And I have found that once people are able to have a scalar understanding of the importance of things, once they can stop moving from black and white thinking and start moving into the realm of ranges and importance and if-then statements and understanding what is good, better, and best versus just what's not optimal and optimal, now all of a sudden they have the ability to find a little bit of balance and be closer to what might be theoretically optimal more often on a day-to-day basis, ironically, than when they were purely light switch on or off, optimal, suboptimal.
Today's show sponsor is Fitness FAQs. Do you want to learn how to master calisthenics? Fitness FAQs has the best workout programs from beginner to advanced level. Use the coupon code podcast10 at checkout to save 10% off when shopping at fitnessfaqs.com. For the people that want to build muscle and strength concurrently, can you speak to this topic? Because it seems as if it's conflicting at some level, but it's also a desirable situation for many people.
Yeah, most people don't just have one goal, despite how much we want to filter them into one or the other, because it's easy for us content creators. And it's always nice to have an enemy, like, oh, this is bad, focus on this, the old 1984 Brave New Worldism, whatever it is. But the reality is exactly what you said. At some level, that becomes an issue, trying to pursue both goals. But that level is way higher than even most competing bodybuilders in my experience. Maybe not at all times, but it is more of a question of the optimization game, which is what we play as competing athletes. Where do I use my resources? I've got a finite amount of resources, and I can stack them all together and try to get the best thing. You give me all these shapes, how do I build the highest tower? If any distance off the ground is progress, it's not so bad. What's the downside, right? So to kind of get more to the heart of what I'm saying, hypertrophy, having more muscle size, more contractile tissue specifically, we know is related to being stronger. If we were just you and I go on the street right now, and we pulled random 10 people off, and then I was like, all right, hop in the car with me, and somehow we fit these 10 people in this clown car. We drove up to AUT, I took them into the lab, and we did an ultrasound assessment of their muscle thickness, of their quadricep, right? We rank ordered them, right? And then we took them over to the HUMAC norm, which is an isokinetic dynamometer. It restricts them to just being able to do it one velocity and one angular velocity, right? How much torque can they produce for knee extension? We would see probably 7 to 8 out of overlap where you could rank order them in terms of quadricep muscle thickness and, isokinetic knee extension torque values. The vast majority of their strength will be explained by muscle size. It's not the same thing as what happens to a change over 8 weeks when they're squatting. It gets a lot more messy. All of a sudden, dynamical systems, it explodes, and we don't see that same relationship. But we know that bigger muscles, on average, are stronger muscles over some time course. So if you want to be stronger, built into the best way to approach that, the optimization game, is to also be making the muscles for the movements that you're trying to be stronger at bigger. So then it becomes this awareness of, okay, so hypertrophy is a physiological adaptation. It's not a performance adaptation. Strength, however, is a skill. We got that physiological piece that's contributing to it, but how good am I at doing a sumo deadlift? Should I choose a sumo deadlift? Do I actually have the biomechanics that makes that actually better than a conventional deadlift? What's the injury frequency I have with these two so that I can keep pushing the skill up and also building that physiology? What are the neuromuscular adaptations I'm going to have to lifting heavier? Because I'm not going to do a sumo deadlift for sets of 10 if I want to get as strong as possible, as fast as possible. I might be doing some heavy singles and then some back off work so I can grow the size and that. But do I want to be doing my sets of 10 on the sumo deadlift? Is that the most efficient way for the amount of fatigue that'll increase? So even if we just stay in the strength realm, now all of a sudden we have to think about bodybuilding a little bit. All right, what are the best tools for me to build the size that will contribute to my sumo deadlift strength? And then when and how much time do I need to spend on the skill of specifically lifting heavy on the sumo deadlift in the competition format, if that's what if I'm a competitive powerlifter and I do the sumo deadlift? And then what's that combination, right? So if that's your constraints and you want to be a powerlifter, okay, that's its own optimization game. Now if you say, you know what, I also want to compete in bodybuilding, right? And now you're looking at someone who does this. Now I go, all right, so where's the gimmies and gotchas here? Right? In a perfect world, I probably wouldn't be doing sumo deadlifts at all. I might just be doing RDLs. Okay. But assuming, starting the constraints of my optimization game, I do want to have an increasing and stronger and potentially close to my capability max sumo deadlift. All right. How much specific work on the sumo deadlift for singles and when do I need to do? And then what's the best stuff to do around that for my bodybuilding goal? Overall muscle growth, not just necessarily how do I maximize the big three. Because the powerlifter, even though they need to be as big as possible in all those muscle groups, probably not doing many bicep curls and calf raises. But I can't neglect that. So, okay, how much time, energy, effort, and a loss of resources do I need to dedicate towards bicep curls and calf raises if I'm already doing sumo deadlifts and then I'm going to be doing leg extensions, leg curls, leg press to kind of build the muscle around it? And is that really that different from what the powerlifter is doing? And when you're talking late stage, intermediate, all the way down to novice, there's no real concession. It might take a little bit longer. It might take a little more thought, but ultimately these are very complementary goals. We're not asking someone to be a world-class swimmer while they're also a world-class powerlifter. We're asking them to be really freaking big and also make sure that they're considering all their muscle groups, not just those that contribute to the big three, and also being really, really strong, which powerlifters are already spending like 60% of their time on anyway, right? So the question is the squat, the bench, and the deadlift, if we keep it constrained to the powerlifting bodybuilding sport example, because I think it's an easier way to talk about hypertrophy versus strength, are they the best vehicles for hypertrophy? Not necessarily. Individual dependent, right? You might modify them a little bit. Maybe I'm not going to do a massive powerlifting arch on bench press, right? Maybe I don't do max legal width grip. I want to train my pecs at a longer muscle length, right? Maybe I would slow down the eccentric on my deadlifts, and now I can't do quite as much volume because I'm accruing a little more muscle damage and fatigue. So with modifications, sure, these movements can be decent vehicles for hypertrophy, and that's kind of where you enter the power builder. For me, I don't typically do like I'm going to do 5x5 on the big three and then some accessories. That's a perfectly fine way to do it, and that's great if your goals are strength and hypertrophy and you want to kind of just build them all simultaneously. For me, as someone who is at a reasonable high level in both sports, I've actually gotten pro qualified back in the day in one natural bodybuilding organization. I'm fighting for a pro card in the most competitive one, the WNBF, and I've competed internationally in the IPF. I'm not fantastic, but I'm a pretty decent powerlifter. I'm hoping one day to maybe be able to go to worlds in the 83 kilo class, but I'm 100 kilos off what's considered like good or elite for sure. So for me, I have to do things a little bit differently. I think about, all right, take a bodybuilding program, right? Get on my volume needs, get my everything perfect. And that's not necessarily tapping out all of my resources because you're not typically constrained. It's not CrossFit, volume's associated with hypertrophy, but there's a point of such diminishing returns where doing one less set makes no difference, but it does tap resources. So if I'm doing an appropriate amount of work to get pretty damn close to what I think is optimal for bodybuilding, do I have the remaining resources to hit some singles afterwards? And that's kind of where I'm at now in this bodybuilding phase, because I am going to do powerlifting in this coming up next year in 2024. So I don't want my strength to regress to the point where I can't build on it. So I've basically got 2 singles on bench, 1 single on squat, 1 single on deadlift that I do per week. So I'm not seeing any decay. And I'm also maintaining and building as much muscle as I can, probably more maintaining. I'm pretty deep into contest prep, which is absolutely going to serve me when then I shift to powerlifting. And then the question is, how do I maintain all my muscle mass and not decay as a bodybuilder while I'm focusing more and more of my time on the powerlifting movements? And I'm still going to grow some muscle. It's not like powerlifters don't grow. Is it going to be optimal in every single muscle group in my body? Probably not. But the question is how much am I really missing out on being basically, if there's, best, better, and good. And if I'm basically shifting between better and good to then when I'm actually actively competing in one, or I should say better and best, and then shifting to, one step up, one down from either one, am I missing out on that much? Eventually over the course of a decade. But also for me as a dual sport athlete, that's what I'm trying to do. So I'm optimizing within the constraints of someone who's interested in being the best powerlifter and bodybuilder in the same lifespan that they can be. And I think if we're honest with ourselves, most people are doing some version of that. They were a cyclist at some point, or they took a couple of years off bodybuilding, or they became a dad. So I don't have kids. I didn't have a real sporting background before I got into bodybuilding and powerlifting. So yeah, these concessions I'm making, are they really that much worse than someone who took a break to have toddlers? They're probably better. You don't get to sleep with kids, So, so anyway, my point is they can be very complementary, and the proof is in the pudding when you look at some very, very high level strength athletes who have also competed in bodybuilding and vice versa. I'm not the best example, but you can find this in other sports as well. Bo Jackson, pro in multiple sports back from the late 80s and 90s. That's a throwback to show that I'm 40. But there's other examples as well, like Deion Sanders. He's a little more contemporary, and you can find them to where they're both in the realm of athleticism, and there is obviously transfer from more general sports skills to more specific sports skills. So specialization, it is the way to optimize things, but it requires a lot more resources to get to 100%, when maybe you could be a little more generalized in your approach, get to 98% in two things with the same amount of effort. And if that's what you want to do, then do it.
That resource management is key. Having your priorities set allows you to establish how much work in each domain you should do. And I've heard that from yourself just now and other people doing this more hybrid power building type of approach. They're not trying to do the max amount of volume, effort relative to failure, plus all of their specific strength work to a really high standard, because all that fatigue, it's going to get counterproductive and you'll just plateau or even regress depending on your advancement. It's about shifting it depending on what is your priority, and just knowing that if you're going to specialize in one area, you'll improve to a greater extent and faster than the person who has a more balanced approach. So once you're aware of this resource management, it gives you a lot more peace of mind knowing that your results will be contingent on where your focus is, so to speak.
Very well said. And I think it's worth pointing out that is essentially the conversation of what periodization is. And that's the same conversation when you have a single sport athlete, right? Because we have acknowledged in modern sports science that the Deion Sanders has to have a good aerobic engine, a good anaerobic engine, has to be able to cut and react, needs to be reasonably strong and produce a fair amount of force, and needs to be able to produce power. And we also know from sports science, it's challenging to get all of those things simultaneously. So already we're breaking it down into phasic timing, and then we have to think about recovery from the games. So it is just a different resource management problem depending upon what the goals of the individual are. And you're not conceding as much as you think you are in many cases. When you are already talking about high-level concepts in sports science or bodybuilding or powerlifting, we're already talking about going from 95% to 97% or 98%. So, if someone is going, I'm okay with being at 95% in two things instead of, 50% and 98% as my kind of default. And then, like I do, when I'm within a year of competing in bodybuilding, I do shift and I look a lot more like a bodybuilder, knowing that I'm only going to regress so far because these things are very close to one another. Then you start to see that the concession is not nearly as much as some talking heads might make it to be.
Given that we can build muscle from anywhere from 5 reps to around 30-ish reps, given sufficient effort relative to failure, what's the real world implication of low reps, high reps, compound isolation exercises?
Great question. Yeah, and the framing is perfect. So when we match effort, we do see that sets of 5 or 6 on a per set basis in a vacuum, if we're just looking at the stimulus, will produce a similar amount of growth to something in the 20 to 30 rep range. Your mileage may vary. There's a cool study by Lasavicius where they compared a similar volume at a similar effort all the way from 20% of 1RM to 80% of 1RM. And it was only 20% of 1RM where they didn't get as much hypertrophy. So that's a lot of freaking reps, 20% of 1RM. We're talking 40, 50 for most people. And you have to think about, what does failure look like and why is it happening when you have to do 50 reps on a movement? Are we sure that that's muscular failure? Is it actual, contractions not being able to keep going? Or are you ready to throw up? Is it just general discomfort and cardiometabolic fatigue? It's probably difficult to say it's all muscular failure or even predominantly that. It's also a lot more like cardio. Like, are we inducing almost a concurrent training effect here? So it's hard to say, but nonetheless, we know there is a bottom end threshold to how light you can go, or essentially how high rep you can go, to where those on a set per set basis become not very feasible. And even below that, certain exercises doing 15 plus reps, even if that's way less than the 40 or 50 I was talking about, it's a really bad match. Like, if you want to maintain a high level of effort and do sets of 15 to 20 on squats, good luck, unless you're in fantastic shape, doing much else after that. 4 sets of 15 on squats to a 0 to 2 RIR, where you need a spotter on your last set of squats, That is the workout. What else are you going to be doing? But if you did that on leg extensions or leg press even, now all of a sudden there's a 5-minute recovery period, some bro fists and a little bit of nausea, and then you're back into the rest of your leg workout, right? It doesn't take much to make that reasonable. So there's some practical limits on how high rep you want to go because it produces so much acute fatigue and different types of fatigue than you're actually looking for. And also it makes it harder to gauge actual muscular proximity to failure. One thing we've seen when we're investigating people's subjective ability to gauge how close they are to actually doing the last concentric rep, that the higher those reps go, and we saw this in the meta-analysis by Halpern, when you're over 12 reps, you start to underestimate more, which is exactly that. Total discomfort, total cardiometabolic fatigue. You're doing 15 reps on a movement. You think you're at a 2 RAR, you might be at a 4. But when you're doing 8 reps, you're more likely to actually be at that 2 RAR or closer to it. So you get worse at gauging how close to failure you are. So your perceived discomfort inflates your perceived RIR. And you're also, because of that discomfort, there's a cost. You're all that cardiometabolic fatigue, potentially preventing you from doing much else in that workout very effectively. And also creating a lot of psychological stress. Like, oh, do I got to do that on my next leg day on Thursday? Okay, So all of a sudden we see a kind of an upper level logistical and physiological constraint for 2 different reasons, and psychological constraint, your perception of RIR. So going too high rep, at least for most movements, or at least for compound free weight movements, not a good idea. And on the other side of it, you absolutely can build muscle with triples and doubles and singles. It's just how many do you want to do, right? Because ultimately it's like the impulse, which is the force over time, the total amount of time spent at a high intensity. So yeah, that single is the most effective rep you can do, but you only got one of them. So if you want to get the equivalent of a 5 or 6 rep set, you got to do 5 singles, and you're going to need recovery time. That's pretty stressful. It's heavy. It's higher risk. It's higher load. It's higher joint compressive forces. And I'm not trying to sell a narrative of fragility, but if you have to do 30 sets of 1 to grow as much as 3 by 10, is that the best decision? Like, it becomes very obvious. And on a per set basis, we actually have data showing that there's a study by Schoenfeld and colleagues, for example, they did 3 sets of 2 to 4 RM. So they're failing or don't think they can do another rep between 2 to 4 reps. So 3 rep max on average, right? 3 by 3, if you will, heavyweight versus a 3 by 8 to 12. And you actually saw more growth in the group doing 3 by 8 to 12. And the reason being is that these sets just don't last long enough. Now, as you go heavier, the reps take longer, right? So if you do a set of 4, it's probably going to take as long as a set of 6, maybe something like that. But there is a point where it just gets too inefficient, right? Where you're recruiting everything. So principle of exercise science, Henneman's size principle, basically states that we recruit motor units, which are what innovate groups of muscle fibers, on an as-needed basis per their size, hence size principle. So higher threshold motor units, which recruit stronger, more powerful muscle fibers, are recruited when needed. And there's multiple ways to get there. One, you can just load up 80% of 1 RM or heavier. Just load a heavy-ass weight, and the force demands alone will require you to recruit pretty much everything, if not everything, straight off the gate. And that's doing that triple. However, just because you recruited a muscle fiber doesn't mean it's necessarily being trained. So we have some very fatigue-resistant fibers that are getting recruited. We're recruiting all those slow-twitch fibers, the same fibers that are helping me talk with my hands right now, that are extremely fatigue-resistant to lift that weight, not the ones in my hands specifically. Let's say my postural support muscles in my back, lumbar, legs for this 1 RM squat I'm doing. They're contributing. They're coming to the party because everybody's got to come to the party. It takes a village to lift this 1 RM squat, right? But those fatigue-resistant fibers that can walk for a day straight, did they really get a training stimulus from that 1 rep? Probably not. And what we're seeing is that you might need to do sets that last long enough. 5, 6 reps is kind of where it seems to be, where on a per set basis, you can count sets as equivalent on the stimulus side, at least, for hypertrophy. Another way to get there is you choose a light load. Sure, we could put 70% on the bar. Not everything's going to get recruited. But if I just keep doing reps, eventually, through what we think is happening, motor unit cycling. So, okay, you're still doing these reps? You're going to do 20 reps to 70%? You're going to go to failure? Oh, shit. All right, I got to pull this one in. Okay, these guys are starting to get fatigued. I got to pull this one in. All right, these guys are fatigued. I'm going to pull this one in. And by the time you get to the end of that set, or reasonably close to failure, there's been a sufficient stimulus to grow everything. So those are your options. You can do low rep sets, you can do high rep sets, and you'll get to the same endpoint. And most of the data we have suggests that on a per set basis, those are both viable ways to train. But then the pragmatic aspects come in. Do you want to do all sets of 5 to 6? Do you want to be the power builder? Do you want to do that on tricep pushdowns? Like, why? We're not trying to get stronger on tricep pushdowns. Even if you're a power builder, you're doing tricep pushdowns to make your triceps bigger, to make your bench press higher, right? So why not do sets of 10 to 12 and just not be a jerk to your elbows? So you start to think about it from a more practical perspective, and you realize, okay, I don't want to be doing cardiometabolic work on these free weight, compound, technically demanding, high risk exercises. That's where I'm going to do my sets of 4 to 8 at a little bit further from failure, because they're heavy enough to already be recruiting everything. So I'll do sets of 4 to 6 at 3 reps shy of failure on squats, and then I'll move to leg press. A little bit less cardiovascular demanding, less technical, lower risk. All right, now I'm going to do sets of 6 to 10 and go a little closer to failure. Now I'm going to stop at like a 1 to 2 RIR. Okay, now I want to finish my quad work. I'm going to do leg extensions, and I'm going to hit failure on my third set of 12 to 15, right? And because I don't need to put that much that much stress through my knee joint, and sets of 10 or heavier just bother me a little bit, maybe. So that's the type of decisions you make. And what it comes out to being is exactly what you said. The 5 to 20 rep range is where you're doing 90% of your work. Sometimes it might be different. You're doing bicep curls, you want to catch a sick pump, you got elbow tendonitis. Sure, do 30, right? Go party. Go to the club afterwards. You look amazing. But most of the time, you're making a decision of the combination of RIR, proximity to failure, load, exercise selection, and rep range, and suiting that to not only what you're doing in this session, but when's the next time I need to train that same muscle group, and what is my total target volume per week. And that is what is going to inform those decisions. And a lot of people just don't know that that's the calculus, and they're just going to failure on squats, and they feel like that was a sick workout, produced a whole lot of discomfort, and they're definitely going to grow and be better, but it's not necessarily playing that optimization game very well.
Well said. Given we understand that idea of how the rep range and intensity is an important principle, how do we guide our exercise selection to fit within that? Because it seems as if that's the most important consideration. Now, given that the amount of exercise there are now in the fitness domain, there's so many for every single body part. Can you help us decide what the most suitable exercise variation is for our body, and knowing with confidence what that looks like?
Yeah, personal preference, comfort, joint range of motion, prior injury history is the first thing I'm going to throw out there, because it's the one that changes per person, right? What do you have access to, right? I can sit here and go, well, we should be doing, standing leg extensions or lying back leg extensions so we can train the rectus femoris at a longer length for quad development. And we need to do that in addition to squats. But if you're like, bro, I got a barbell, it's like, all right, never mind. So that's the first disclaimer, if you will. The second thing to consider is, I'll just give you the list of stuff that matters, right? So we generally know that when you train a muscle group at a longer length, it's going to get a greater stimulus if there's tension at that longer muscle length. So anything that is going to train a muscle at a shorter length is generally not as good as something that trains at a longer length. And anything that might train at a longer length but doesn't produce tension there might do worse than one that trains it at a moderate length but has a lot of tension at that more moderate length. So this is just one way of enhancing the tension of an exercise. So here's a good example. If you were to do a back extension, right, at the top, when the glutes are at their shortest position, is typically where it gets really hard because the lever arm is getting higher, right? It's not a bad exercise. There's nothing wrong with it. And especially if let's say you have trouble at lockout with deadlifts, maybe you're trying to get stronger in that position, it might be a decent accessory. But if your goal is I want to grow my glutes and my lumbar and my hamstring as much as possible, that might not be as good of an exercise if we were just to compare them in a vacuum. But you don't have to do, and you can select both, as say something like an RDL, where because you're on the ground and you're fully bent over, it's at the very beginning of the movement where the tension is highest, where it's also where your glutes and your hamstrings are most elongated, right? So that's the kind of calculus I'm talking about from exercise selection. But then again, if you have a lower back injury, you may not be able to do an RDL at all with any kind of load or proximity to failure without it being an issue. Or maybe you're just a novice lifter and you're not comfortable doing an RDL and you don't want to push it to failure because you're worried about technical breakdown and injury risk. Okay, so you choose the back extension. So that's the kind of calculus that goes into it. On the hypertrophy side, it's really also about what provides, enough stability, which could come from the form of me just being an experienced lifter and being able to be quite stable in some of these compound movements, so that I can actually push myself close to failure and have it not be me versus the exercise versus the load trying to get to failure. And it's more just like I'm locked in and I can just push and go. When you feel like you can just naturally push something and hit close to failure on a movement and you're not worried about form deviations, that's a great exercise for hypertrophy. So a high-level power lifter, they can push a squat to the point where the only thing that changes is the velocity, and then they stop and they get crushed. A decent power lifter, you're going to see them start to shift to different muscle groups. It starts to look a little more like a good morning. They come back in. And that's also somewhat just due to their limb lengths. And they might always be that way, even when they're a world-class performer. But if they're built the right way and if they're experienced with the lift, all of a sudden it becomes a viable option for them to use as a hypertrophy vehicle to push near failure, but only in the right rep ranges, right? So you take someone who can squat 700 pounds and you have them do a set of 10 to a failure, that's going to be abusive. They're going to take forever to recover from that. The reason why they can be so locked in is the reason why they can lift so much is the reason why you want to maintain maybe a more moderate rep range. So there's the pairing of RIR reps and exercises, which you were talking about. And one thing we know, there's a recent series of meta-regressions that got published by Zach Robinson and colleagues, group out of FAU. For hypertrophy, once you're around 80% of 1RM or higher, your proximity to failure doesn't really seem to matter because Henneman's size principle, right? So long as the set lasts long enough. So if we think about, for most people, 80% of 1RM, that's probably their 6 to 10 RM. So when you're dealing with these big compound free weight movements, don't take them off the table like some people on TikTok and be like, too unstable, not a good movement. No, you can use a squat, you can use a bench press, you can use a deadlift, you can use an RDL. But if you want to use it as a vehicle for hypertrophy, you probably want to be at the low end of this rep range. And then because it's at the low end of this rep range, you have the luxury of using a higher RIR. So you can maintain technical proficiency and you're not training different muscle groups. You're not shifting into a good morning. So if you want to use squats for a quad and glute hypertrophy stimulus, more power to you. Don't do sets of 10. Do sets of 6 and stop at like a 2 to 4 RIR. And that's going to be on average around 80% of 1RM. Each one of those sets, despite being submaximal, will still be just as effective as if you'd gone to failure, less fatigue, and you're able to actually stay in the pocket of the technical deviation that you want, training the same muscle groups. And that can be something you decide to use if you want to be someone who has, not just show, but also go. Like if you want to be a power builder, if you want to train both. And then you can get more stable and train closer to failure and do higher reps based upon how much muscle mass is involved. So you probably don't want to do sets of 30 on leg press. Maybe you're now doing 8 to 12. Any higher than that, it just starts to get discomforting. And then when you isolate a muscle group, when you're using a machine, single joint movement, that's when you can actually decide to do higher reps, reduce joint stresses, and you can really go to failure even beyond and do like some partials at long muscle lengths, so long as you decide that's an appropriate thing to do for the overall context of your program.
Once you understand those principles, it's very liberating because then you don't get that fear of missing out. You see someone else on your social media feed doing an exercise that you haven't done for a while, you want to put in your program, you're thinking if that's better than what you're currently doing. But once you understand these principles of effort relative to failure, the exercise that suit your body, are you doing it through a full range of motion, all those excellent points you just mentioned, you can be very free knowing that what you're doing is working and you can stick with it long enough to progressively overload and actually make progress. I feel that that is very key. Can you elaborate further on that stretch partials, stretch mediated hypertrophy notion? Because that's come out in the last few years and it's something that a lot of bodybuilders are starting to do. What does that look like and why should we do it?
Yeah, an interesting thing is that some bodybuilders were doing it back in the day just intuitively. I had the pleasure and privilege of meeting Ronnie Coleman when I was in Texas most recently. And one of the ways that we prepared for our interview with him was we watched his most recent documentary, Ronnie Coleman, The King, 2018, very good. And they had a lot of clips of his old training back from his bodybuilding documentary, Ronnie Coleman, unbelievable. And you watch him doing squats and he doesn't fully lock out. Goes all the way down, doesn't fully lock out. You watch him do shoulder press, incline press, and dumbbells. He's going all the way down, but he doesn't go all the way up. And if you were to talk to some of not all these bodybuilders did it. So this is not a case of, the bros were right, because there's plenty of bros who were doing the top range and just, ego lifting because they could lift more, right? But if you were to ask those who do that, they would say it feels better. Like I feel like I'm maintaining a better tension. I'm getting more stimulus, and maybe even I felt I grew more when I did that consistently. So it's this kind of observational, lived experience knowledge that not everyone had. Again, key piece here. There's a million different anecdotes. If you just go, oh, like this bro already figured it out. Like, did he figure it out? That's what he was doing. He didn't know why. Again, science and experience go hand in hand. So anyway, some bodybuilders have been doing this. They kind of feel like they're maintaining constant tension, right? And the data is actually quite interesting. And as more studies come out, we find it applies to more muscle groups, and it's a more consistent effect. Now we've got a handful of studies that through different avenues show that when you're training a muscle at a longer relative length, you seem to get better hypertrophy. And this is something that was hidden in the range of motion data before. So there was a systematic review by Gurgic and Schoenfeld where they were like, we noticed that full range of motion is better, but not necessarily always. When the shortened partial includes the long muscle length, we don't actually see full range of motion being better. But that's not typically what you see people do. Like most of the time, like what are YouTube comments about range of motion? Like, bro, you didn't squat deep enough, right? What you don't see people doing on the internet is just doing the bottom portion of squats. You might see some bodybuilders doing it, not locking out, but people are cutting short depth on squats and presses. And you're like, you're not doing it right. And what you also sometimes see, and this is what's a little bit different, is not finishing their rows, right? So you see cheaty rows, or you see people who are using momentum, or you see the really science-based crowd like stopping when they hit a 10 RIR because they can no longer touch their chest with the barbell or with the cable. But they probably could have done another 10 reps not touching their chest. And the difference between these two things is that when you're not finishing on a row, you're staying in a longer relative position for longer. When you're doing a half squat, you're never getting into the longer position. And these things we find through some studies are not the same. So we actually have several studies now in multiple different muscle groups that have found that when you're doing partial ranges of motion, but you're staying in the longer position, it actually produces similar or often better results than if you're doing full range of motion. And that seems to be because you're spending more of your efforts in that more lengthened position producing higher tension. Because it still takes contractile effort, metabolic energy, to do that shortened position that's not putting as much stretch on it, which takes away from this optimization game, resource management, what you can put into the lengthened position. So we have this, like I said, from multiple different angles. So controlling for range of motion, some of the coolest studies that we first did. This is a study, not we, broadly the scientific community, like Mao and colleagues, compared seated leg curls versus lying leg curls. So same total range of motion about the knee, same degrees of knee flexion in both groups, but only difference is one group is in a seated reach position, right? If you think about how do we stretch our hamstrings, we do a sit and reach test, right? So if you're doing a seated leg curl, we actually see that the muscles that are stretched when you're in hip flexion, the hamstring group, they grew more. And interestingly enough, conversely, in the group that was doing the lying leg extension, the muscles that contribute to knee flexion that attach on the front of the hip, like the sartorius, that long strap-like muscle that you can sometimes see in contest-ready bodybuilders, that is a weak knee flexor. And it's stretched when you're standing more than when you're in hip flexion because it attaches anteriorly to the hip. That grew more in the lying leg curl group. Despite them both producing the same number of degrees of range of motion about the knee, we see that range of motion seems to be mostly a proxy for the muscle lengths that are being trained at. And that is what is actually impacting differences in hypertrophy for muscle length. So then that's when these studies came out of, all right, well, how do we manipulate muscle length in training? Well, how about I have this group that's only training at the long muscle length? So Cassiano and colleagues, one of the most recent studies, they got 3 different groups doing calf raises on a leg press. One group doing a full range of motion, coming all the way into dorsiflexion, all the way into plantar flexion. Another group is starting kind of midway through plantar flexion. So their foot is parallel to their tibia, right? Just at a 90-degree angle, and only doing the top range of motion of that calf raise, not coming all the way down. And then the third group is starting in that dorsiflex position and only going to that parallel position where their foot is perpendicular to their tibia, right? And the group that did the bottom range of motion, the first half of the calf raise, grew almost twice as much as the group that did full range of motion on the calf raise. Now, I don't think you're going to expect twice the gains. That's just one study. That's their sampling variance in there, I'm sure. But this has been found consistently in several studies. Pedrosa found it in the quads, for example. There's a abstract coming out by Mao that was presented at a conference that found it with a multi-hip in the glutes. There is data on the biceps, if I recall correctly, from Goto. There's data by Mao as well on the triceps. So we've seen it in the arms, the glutes once that goes through full peer review. Also, we see that in squats, like Kubo and colleagues saw greater glute hypertrophy in a group that was squatting deeper than another. So we see quads, hamstrings, glutes, biceps, triceps. Pretty much every muscle group that we've measured, at least in one study, is either getting better results from doing lengthened partials or biased long muscle length position versus shorter. So it's an interesting thing, and we did see some echoes of it anecdotally, like I mentioned with Ronnie and some other IFBB pros, but not consistently. And we didn't know why. There's speculation as to, is it produce more of an occlusive effect, so you're getting more blood pooling? Is it just a tension-mediated thing where you're getting, more mechanosensors at a longer position? We don't know. And anyone who's confidently claiming the mechanism is jumping ahead a little too far in my book. But we do see consistently observed, train with more of your efforts at a longer muscle length, and you seem to get better hypertrophy in that muscle group.
This is another point for using a full range of motion and goes against the idea of traditional ego lifting, how old school bodybuilders or people that weren't very aware of what is best practice these days would try and load weights up really heavy for whatever reason they thought that would bring superior results. Whereas now we're much more aware that we'd rather swap absolute load for a load that can be used through a full range of motion to overload us in that stretch position because of the superior hypertrophy benefits. So for people that start getting into a lot of ego lifting with super heavy loads, might be shooting yourself in the foot. And I know from my own personal experience, there's a correlation between my range of motion and my results. Whenever I've used a more abbreviated range of motion, sure, I'm getting stronger from an absolute perspective on whatever exercise I'm doing. Arguable, the form standard is a bit compromised compared to using that full range of motion, much lighter loads, using good proximity to failure. The results are just night and day, Eric. And I couldn't stress that enough to people, to choose weights within your means and really chasing that technique quality first and foremost, because it's just very transformative.
Generally, I agree. But the funny thing is that's very movement specific. So
True. Good caveat.
So if you think about rows, but everything you say is still true, like within the movement constraints of what you decide is optimal, instead of shifting towards ego. So if you decide, all right, strict interpretation of what is a row, I'm not going to count the rep and I will stop the set at it's a 10 quote unquote RPE when I no longer touch my chest. You're going to have to use a far lighter weight than if you went, you know what, I'm just going to do the first half of this row. I'm still going to keep a rigid torso, still going to fully extend, still going to have a specific stopping point when my arm is parallel to my body. So I'm still, maybe 6 inches away from quote unquote full range. That'll allow you to lift 20, 30% more. You can row heavier weight, but you will be able to probably get a better stimulus cutting that range in half.
Nice.
So it's a funny thing. And I think where there's the most potential for someone to change their physique with this technique is probably not in like the quads or the chest or the delts or the pecs and the biceps, because the force curve, the strength curve, and the biomechanics of those movements, they're already harder in the stretch position. Like you don't get stuck like trying to grind out the last 2 inches of a squat. Like, I can't lock it out. That's not a thing. It's hardest in the bottom. So when you do like deep squats with a pause, your weights come way down, right? Doing the lengthened partial position. But on rows, on delt work, right? We're used to using dumbbell lateral raises, and now you're doing like cross body cable lateral raise and only coming up 3/4 of the way. All of a sudden, interestingly enough, especially on the back work, where it's harder as you move towards the last range of motion, you're using heavier weights and doing a partial range of motion and getting better results. So philosophically, 100% agree. It is setting what's the appropriate movement standard, adhering to it rigidly, and focusing on performance, not just lifting the heaviest load. But just because of the biomechanical constraints of rows and lat pull downs, you're going to have to choose heavier weights than you would use for a full range of motion. when you're doing these lengthened partials, or you're going to be doing twice as many reps.
Perfect. I'm really glad that you honestly pulled me up on that distinction, because that is very true. As much as I'd like to simplify it to full range of motion over everything, that is a great point, that it's movement specific and you have to adjust your ethos to get the best results. And you explain that very well.
Man. And I think the one place in kind of the functional realm where people who have non-hypertrophy goals, where that really is a paradigm shift that's going to be hard to accept because there's some ego, there's some morality attached to it, is pull-ups.
Oh yeah, here we go. Calisthenics, let's go. It took us an hour and a half. Tell me about it.
Got there. This is for you. So, I come from a military background. I was 4 years in the Air Force, so I knew a lot of Marines. And Marines will not let you do anything except for you get your chin. If it's not over the bar, it doesn't count as nothing. But the funny thing is, moving from the position where the bar is at the top of your head to your chin being over the bar is way harder. But it's also where all those muscles are in a shortened position. So now, if you want to be strong in that position, if you want to be able to do certain movements, if you're training for movement and you're trying to be good at calisthenics, absolutely, you got to figure it out. You got to be able to do a muscle up, and you got to build up to that, all that good stuff that I am incapable of doing, probably would explode my shoulder doing, and I would not look like an athlete in that context. But if you are someone who wants to use pull-ups to grow your lats and your back and your biceps as much as possible, you're probably better off not necessarily forcing yourself to come up all the way. Or maybe after you do your 10 full pull-ups, you get 5 partials afterwards. And that'll be more effective than if you had strictly gone, no. Marine mentality, baby.
Particularly with the pull-up as well, because from experience, when you're getting towards the top of that rep, especially on the ones closer towards failure, there's almost this momentum jerk to get you through that final range of motion. So how much tension is really on the muscle? You throw in some heavy weight on there, and a lot of it's just the force generated from the bottom. Those that are interested in using the pull-up for hypertrophy purposes would be better off milking out a couple of lengthened partials, even if it's half range, because that's when you'll fully stress the lats and shoulder extensors, etc.
Absolutely. And I think that's kind of a hard pill to swallow for the pull-up purists, but it is the way it probably works. But again, your goal may not be to build the biggest lats.
This is what I'm talking about. And I wish that when we're interacting as a community, we understood the goal people were going for in whatever they're posting, because you can call out literally anything depending on the context that you're looking at it through. If I'm looking at it through a strength perspective, if you're not getting that chin above the bar, you're a pussy. Whereas if you're stopping your set short and not doing those extra few reps where you can't get your chin over the bar, if you're in a bodybuilding context, then that doesn't fit that narrative. So we just need to be more open-minded for whatever goal we're pursuing, and then train in accordance with that.
100%. I have videos of my training that I won't put online where I have strapped 30 kilos to my body and I'm only doing half chin-ups. And I'm not trying to get wrecked in the comments by the calisthenics guys telling me I'm an ego lifter.
Sometimes, Eric, that'd be a good marketing trick to get that engagement.
It's also, it's potentially a teachable moment, but I have to have the time and energy and resilience to want to have to eye roll at 100 comments. So
perfect. I'll go through one more question, Eric, just to cap this off. So what is junk volume, and what are the practical implications of finding the sweet spot for how much work we should do?
Great question. So junk volume, when people say that, it means performing work that has some type of cost, metabolic, psychological, energy expenditure, which maybe if you're just trying to burn calories is not that junky, but it is not contributing to muscle growth. And depending on who you talk to, they will set the threshold for what is junk volume at different points. You talk to, I don't know why, but the latest craze of Mike Mentzer adherence, it's basically anything where you're not, nearly at failure. You talk to people in the evidence-based crew and they're like, it's got to be at least a 6 RPE. Anything below that's doing nothing. Objectively, going back to that Zach Robinson series of meta regressions, when they looked at the relationship between as you get closer to failure, what happens to the stimulus, there's a curvilinear response. So that it is true that as you get closer and closer to failure, there's actually a disproportionate increase in the stimulus. And that's a huge win for that Mike Mentzer crowd. They're like, oh shit, So when I moved from 2 RIR to 1 RIR to 0 RIR, actually it's starting to curve up a little bit. So they were right. It's those last reps that really do matter. But in that same graph, there's a disappointing thing that's going to piss them off, is that there's a positive relationship, as in it actually does seem to grow muscle based upon the analysis, all the way down to a 10 RIR. So if you want to accept this analysis to support your biases, you get to accept the whole analysis, right? You got to go, all right, yes, 0 RIR is better than a 1 or a 2 RIR. Suck it, you evidence-based volume junkies. But you also have to say, but it's not just the reps that are near failure that count. Pretty much even the first reps in a set of 15 are doing something. And now, why might that be? First, we can't accept that relationship to be the perfect representation of what happens in the real world. It is an estimate, right? And we also have to realize that for someone who just started training, like a novice, doing 5 reps with 60% of 1RM, yeah, that's at a 20 RIR. But that's the heaviest weight they've ever done before, ever. The heaviest squat they've done prior to that point was getting off the toilet with nothing on their back, right? So it's progressive overload. So when you have a mixture of people who are trained and untrained at various levels, and when we're talking about having large enough samples to see small changes, yeah, like most things that we consider junk volume are probably not junk volume. They're just lower quality volume. And it is not, it's a poor optimization game. So like, for example, you may be able to do like if someone has a strict interpretation of the effective reps model that some people throw around, and they go anything past a 5 RIR does nothing, they'll actually be proven wrong by most studies, right? And I would say even probably most practical experiences. But you have to do a lot more, and it doesn't make sense. Like, would you rather do 5 sets of 10 at a 5 RIR, or maybe 2 sets of 10 to failure, right? So that's a 50 versus 20 rep comparison. It's more than doubling to get to the same place. And I'm not sure that's exactly what the relationship looks like, but that wouldn't surprise me if that was the relationship. So you can cut short your RIRs and do a lot of volume. Is it junk volume? No, it's just really suboptimal. So it's kind of, where's that convergence point where you can do enough work to be maximizing the work side of the equation, but it's also at a high enough quality so you're not necessarily undershooting the efficiency of it. And there's probably some inflection point to the other side of it. Like, well, Eric, then why wouldn't I just train to failure, do the least amount of sets needed to optimize it? Well, the unfortunate thing is that we're limited by the data set. So that series of meta-regressions and every meta-analysis we have on failure, 90% of the studies plus, they're done with people training 2 or 3 times per week. And if you're playing the optimization game, you're probably not training 2 or 3 times per week, or you're already not optimal, right? You're a serious recreational lifter. So when you survey bodybuilders, depending on the survey, depending on their phase of training, they're training 4 to like 8+ times per week, right? I'd say probably on average they're training 5 times a week, right? So they're training twice as much as what has been meta-analyzed. I can't say with confidence that when you're training 5 times a week and doubling the volumes that are meta-analyzed, that you don't have to worry about going to failure, that doesn't actually become too much on the fatigue side of it. And in my experience as both a competitor and a coach, and for doing that for years, there's probably some middle ground and some individual response where you're trying to figure out, where do I need to stop these sets, on what exercises, and on what time course related to what I need to train the muscle group again, to get the most stimulus I can to then do it again. Heal on time, as Mike Israetel would say, before I then produce another bolus of stimulus. And if I go too far on the volume or too far on the intensity, training too close to failure or past or to failure all the time, I'm reducing kind of the optimization that I could get. Some people will do better with, say, 6 to 8 sets per muscle group and actually taking it to the house. Some people will do better with 20 sets and they're only taking like the last set per muscle group per session to failure, and the rest is in a 3-2-1 type of RIR range. And it's difficult to know where that is without experimentation, but we know that that's both people on both kind of paradigmatic examples on the end of that spectrum exist. Or some people could get similar results with both. And it's then a question of what is less mentally stressful for them. Some people find it very easy to go to and past failure or on certain exercises. Some people don't, and that's very hard, but they're happy to do another set. So where's the place of least friction? To go all the way back to the start of our conversation, even true in bodybuilders. What allows you to put forth the necessary effort to get the maximal stimulus is where that less friction comes from. If you're someone who you've got much more focus and ability to empty the gas tank, if you do 5 really hard sets for a muscle group and you do that twice per week, awesome. But if one of those really hard sets kind of tanks you out and you're slosh for the rest of the workout, then you stop it at 2 RIR and you do 7 sets and do that twice per week. And that's better for you because of whatever combination of physiological and psychological factors enables you to make that the thing that you milk.
Would I be right in suggesting that matching up enjoyment with performance as a proxy would be a good indicator of determining our volume landmarks?
Probably in someone who is really motivated and enjoys training as the entry point. So like if we're talking about people like you and I who actually listen to podcasts on fitness, 100%. If you're talking about people who their initial view of fitness is like, this is like brushing my teeth or going to the dentist, like I know I should do it and I am doing it. Enjoyment might look like starting to walk towards the gym and then going to go shopping or something like that. So I think probably not. But I would say lower discomfort might be kind of something that goes across both. Because as much as I like training hard, I don't necessarily like discomfort. I like knowing that I emptied the tank towards something that was productive. So if you told me that a set of 8 reps on squats at a 3 RIR, like I mentioned earlier, was equivalent to doing a set of 15 to failure as far as the stimulus, I'm going to choose 8 to a 3 RIR every time because I'm not actually trying anymore, maybe in my early days, just to feel like I wrecked myself. I was trying to wreck myself in my early days because I thought that was better. But once I knew better that it was about the stimulus, then I'd be like, no, I don't want to take that trade because then the rest of my workout's worse, right? So I think it does that is the answer is yes if they're fully informed and invested.
Dr. Eric Helms, thank you so much for taking us down the rabbit hole of hypertrophy, muscle growth, and the psychology of fitness. Where can people find out more about your work if they want to do some more homework?
You're very welcome. And if you want to do a deeper dive, check out massresearchreview.com. That's where myself and very capable colleagues, Dr. Eric Trexler, Dr. Mike Zerdos, and Lauren Colenso Semple. If you're interested in working with a bodybuilding coach, check out 3dmusclejourney.com. I am the scientific advisor to our awesome coaches to make sure that they have all this information at their fingertips to do the best job with their athletes. And then finally, if you're interested in kind of learning the books, you already throw them out there. I won't promote it again, but Muscle and Strength Pyramids. Yeah. Oh, and then if you want to just listen to all the stuff I do outside of my own typical work, like I'm sure I'll be posting this awesome podcast on my Instagram. That is at Helms3DMJ. And from there, you can also see my threads where I share my opinions in short number of characters almost daily.
Perfect. Thanks for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me on.